I'll never forget the sound of those laughs. They weren't happy bursts of joy. They were short, awkward chuckles that rise when someone has just crossed a line and no one dares to stop them. We were seated around a long, elegant table illuminated by warm lamps and crystal glasses. It was my cousin's engagement dinner, a night that was supposed to celebrate love. Yet it turned into the stage for the greatest humiliation of my life. My cousin raised her glass, glanced at me sideways, and said with a mocking smile, "I hope I never end up like her, alone with a child." The room exploded in laughter. I stayed frozen. My name is Elena Vargas. I am 32 years old and a single mother to a wonderful boy named Ian, who was 7 at the time. That night I still didn't know it, but everything was about to change. No one in that room could imagine what would happen next, and least of all me. Before I tell you how that dinner took a turn no one expected, let me say something. If you've ever had to stand tall while others doubted you, this story is for you. And if you're listening to me right now, tell me where you're watching from and subscribe. Because what happened that night was not just a silent reckoning. It was a revelation that shook my entire family. My life had not always been so complicated. 8 years before that dinner, I was 24 with a future that seemed clear. I was in my final year of nursing school, specializing in pediatrics. I had always wanted to work with children. My professors said I had a special sensitivity and a patience that couldn't be taught from books. I earned good grades, did extra internships, and several hospitals had already shown interest in hiring me after graduation. At home, my mother spoke of me with pride. "My daughter will be a pediatric nurse," she would say. I believed in that future, until everything fell apart. I met Marcos during my 3rd year of studies. He was studying business administration, charming, attentive, and had a way of looking at you that made you feel safe. We were together for almost a year before moving into the same apartment. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but we talked about plans, about getting married someday, about a quiet life. When I discovered I was pregnant, it wasn't planned. For me, it wasn't a tragedy. There was fear. Yes, but also hope. For Marcos, it was different. He changed. He started coming home late, answering in monosyllables, and emotionally disappearing. I tried to understand him and give him time. I thought the fear would pass. It didn't. One morning, 6 months pregnant, I woke up alone. The closet was empty. A short note lay on the table. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." He changed his number, deleted his social media, and vanished from my life as if he had never existed. The following months were a whirlwind of tears, silence, and a determination that grew almost without me noticing. My father had passed away years earlier, so my mother was my only close support. She helped, yes, but always with that look of disappointment that weighed more than any words. The rest of the family wavered between pity and judgment. Help came with conditions. Comments disguised as advice. When Ian was born on a rainy morning after an endless labor, I held him against my chest and made a promise that still defines me today. "We may be just you and me, but I will give you the best life I can." I had to pause my studies. It wasn't an easy decision. But between the exhaustion, the lack of money, and the constant fear, there was no other choice. My savings ran out quickly. I moved to a small apartment on the outskirts. When Ian was 6 months old, I asked for state assistance. Some relatives never forgave me for that. The first years were incredibly hard. Sleep was a luxury. I worked whenever I could, accepting poorly paid shifts. I took Ian with me whenever someone allowed it. My mother helped. But every gesture came with phrases like, "If you had chosen better," or "This wouldn't have happened if you had been more careful." When Ian turned 3, I returned to nursing school part-time. It was exhausting. I studied at night, worked during the day, and cared for my son every hour. My professors were understanding. I graduated 2 years later than planned. But I did it. The day I received my license, I cried like I hadn't since Ian's birth. It wasn't just pride, it was relief. It was proof that I hadn't failed. 4 years later, I was already working as a pediatric nurse at the Children's Memorial Hospital. I had a stable salary, relatively humane shifts, and above all, I was doing what I loved. Ian and I had our routine. A small but clean apartment. Homework in the afternoon. Simple dinners. Laughter before bed. He was a curious, brilliant boy who loved dinosaurs and could build entire worlds with anything he found. The only thing that never changed was my family's gaze. To them, I remained the example of what not to do, the one who made a mistake, the one who didn't follow the right path. My cousin Valeria, 2 years younger than me, was the complete opposite. Brilliant studies, impeccable career, perfect partner. When she announced her engagement to Daniel, a respected surgeon, the family burst with pride. I received the invitation to the engagement dinner with mixed feelings. I hesitated a lot. In the end, I decided to go. I left Ian with a friend. I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving in a simple dress and discreet makeup, trying to remind myself that I was worth more than the mistakes others attributed to me. In the car, before starting the engine, I took a deep breath. I didn't know that that night, the same one that began with cruel laughter, was about to rewrite my place in the family. And that, although I didn't understand it then, was only the beginning. The restaurant chosen for the engagement dinner was no ordinary place. It was one of those venues where everything seems designed to remind you whether you belong there or not. Immaculate white tablecloths, the finest crystal glasses, waiters who moved in silence as if floating. When I handed my car keys to the valet, I noticed his slight look of surprise at my old compact car. I pretended not to notice. That night I was not going to let anyone make me feel lesser. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself as I crossed the double doors of the venue. The private room was already almost full when I entered. I immediately recognized the voices, the laughs, the quick glances. My mother was the first to see me. She stood up with a controlled smile, gave me a kiss on the cheek, and said I looked well, as if she hadn't expected it. My uncle Ramon, my mother's brother, didn't take long to make his usual comment. "Look who found time for the family," he said in that tone that always carried a hidden criticism. I responded with a polite smile, though inside I already felt the tension rising in my chest. I sat next to my brother Alejandro, one of the few who had always supported me, although he lived far away and rarely attended these gatherings. His hug was sincere and comforting. "I'm glad you came," he whispered. I nodded, grateful for that small gesture of silent support. Around us the others talked about trips, investments, weddings, and future plans. A world that always seemed one step away from mine, but never truly connected. Valeria made her entrance a few minutes later, radiant in a red dress that seemed tailor-made to capture every gaze. She walked confidently, greeting everyone and receiving compliments as if they were natural. When she reached me, she gave me 2 quick kisses. "Elena, how nice that you came. How is Ian, right?" she said, hesitating for a second before remembering my son's name. I nodded without correcting her or showing annoyance. "He's doing very well," I replied. "He's great at school." Valeria smiled politely, clearly uninterested, and moved on to the next guest. The waiters began serving the appetizers, delicate and expensive plates, almost too beautiful to eat. I drank water, listening to conversations about the wedding, the chosen venue, about how important it was to do things right. Every comment seemed to carry an implicit message. My mother nodded at everything. My aunt commented on how lucky Valeria was to have found a man like that, with a future and stability. I simply ate slowly, concentrating on not disappearing into my own chair. It was then that he arrived. Daniel, tall with a confident bearing and a perfectly fitted dark suit. He apologized for the delay and explained something about an emergency at the hospital. Valeria stood up immediately, proud. She presented him as if he were a trophy. When Daniel went around greeting everyone one by one, our eyes met for the first time. Something passed across his expression. I couldn't say what, but there was a second of doubt, of recognition. Maybe I thought it was my imagination. He continued, talking with my mother, with my uncles, integrating easily. During dinner I noticed that Daniel observed me from time to time. Each time he did, he quickly looked away as if he didn't want to be caught. It made me uncomfortable, but it also awakened a strange feeling of familiarity. I couldn't place him. My uncle's comment pulled me out of my thoughts again. "Are you still working at the hospital?" he asked in that tone that minimized everything. I nodded. I explained that I had been promoted recently. My mother intervened to say she was proud, though her voice sounded more surprised than convinced. The toasts began shortly after. My uncle spoke of tradition, of values, of doing things in the correct order. Each word seemed to fall on me like a silent accusation. My grandmother toasted to Valeria, to her success, to the future that awaited her. When my mother asked me to toast as well, I stood up, took a deep breath, and said a few simple words, wishing them mutual support and strength to face the unexpected. I didn't mention traditions or correct paths. When I sat down, my uncle murmured something about successful relationships that I preferred to ignore. The conversation turned back to future plans. Valeria talked about waiting a few years before having children, about economic stability, about preparing everything as it should be. And then she said it. She laughed, took a sip of wine, and added, "I hope I never end up like her, alone with a child." The laughter burst around the table. My uncle capped it with his cruel comment. Even my mother let out a nervous laugh. I felt the blood rush to my face, the knot in my throat, the immediate desire to disappear. I looked at Alejandro. He squeezed my hand under the table. I said nothing. I couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. I only thought about Ian, about everything we had overcome together, about how unfair that moment was. It was then that I looked up and saw Daniel. He was no longer smiling. His expression was serious, tense. He looked at me fixedly, as if something had finally clicked in his head. The room kept laughing, talking, unaware of what was about to happen. Daniel stood up slowly. At first I thought he was going to the bathroom or to make another unimportant toast. But instead of staying next to Valeria, he walked around the table and positioned himself behind my chair. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. I froze. The entire room fell silent. I think everyone should know something, he said in a firm voice. Valeria looked at him confused. I felt my heart beating so hard I could barely breathe. I understood nothing. I only knew that from that moment there was no turning back. The silence that fell over the table was so dense it almost hurt. No one moved. No one spoke. Daniel's hand remained on my shoulder, firm, as if he wanted to anchor me to the present. I didn't dare turn my head. I felt the stares fixed on me, on him, on us. Valeria was the first to react with a nervous laugh that fooled no one. Daniel, what are you doing? She asked in a low voice, trying to maintain her composure. He didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, removed his hand from my shoulder, and addressed the entire room. 6 months ago, he began. I had a serious motorcycle accident on the country road. Visibility was poor and a car invaded my lane. I was thrown off. Several people frowned in confusion, trying to understand why he was telling this in the middle of an engagement dinner. Daniel continued. I arrived at the Children's Memorial Hospital with multiple fractures, a punctured lung, and internal bleeding. The doctors weren't sure I would survive the first night. I felt a chill run down my back. The dates, the hospital. My mind began connecting pieces without me wanting it to. When I woke up in the ICU, Daniel continued, I was alone. My parents lived far away and couldn't come immediately. I was scared, in pain, angry at everything. He made a brief pause before adding. And then a nurse appeared. My breathing stopped. I remembered that room. The number. The young man. Gravely ill. Barely conscious. Who hardly received visits. I remembered the long nights, the silence, the feeling that I couldn't limit myself to doing the minimum. Daniel looked at me directly. She always introduced herself the same way. I'm Elena. I'll be with you tonight. A murmur ran through the table. My mother brought her hand to her mouth. My uncle shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Valeria was completely pale. That nurse, Daniel continued, didn't just do her job. She explained every procedure when I could barely concentrate. She fought to have my medication adjusted when the pain was unbearable. She stayed a few extra minutes when I couldn't sleep. She told me about her son, how he was learning to read, his obsession with dinosaurs. She gave me back my calm when I thought I would never walk again. Tears began to form in my eyes. I also remembered those conversations. I hadn't considered them extraordinary. For me, they were basic humanity. There was one night, Daniel said with a deeper voice, when my lung collapsed again. The monitors hadn't clearly shown it yet, but she noticed my breathing. She acted quickly. The doctor told me later that if it hadn't been for that, the story would have been very different. The room was in shock. No one was laughing anymore. No one spoke. Daniel took another deep breath. I tried to find her after leaving the hospital to thank her, but it wasn't possible. I only knew her name, and that she was a nurse. He looked at me again. Imagine my surprise when I arrive at this dinner and discover that the single mother everyone mocks is the woman who helped me move forward when I had no one. The tears fell without me being able to stop them. Not from shame this time, but from an overwhelming mix of emotion, relief, and a validation I had never received from my own family. Daniel turned toward my uncle. Used goods, he repeated calmly, but with a firmness that chilled the air. That's how you describe someone who dedicates her life to caring for others. Someone who raises a child alone, and still finds the strength to save lives. My uncle lowered his gaze. My mother was visibly trembling, clearly affected. Thanks to Elena, Daniel continued, I'm alive. I'm here. I can get married. I can have a future. And what hurts me most tonight is not remembering the accident, but hearing how her own family minimizes who she is. He raised his glass. My toast is not only for the engagement. It is for her. For true strength. For compassion. For everything that is not seen at first glance. Alejandro was the first to raise his glass, then my grandmother. Little by little, one by one, everyone did. Even my uncle. Though he couldn't look me in the eyes. I remained seated with my heart racing, feeling that the ground beneath my feet had shifted. That dinner, which had begun as yet another repetition of years of judgment, had just broken something deeply rooted. And although I still didn't know it, that moment was only the beginning of a change that would take years to solidify, but which already had no turning back. After Daniel's toast, nothing was the same at that table. The air felt different, heavier, as if everyone were processing at the same time a truth that had been ignored for years. The waiters entered with dessert, unaware of the emotional earthquake that had just shaken my family. The clinking of plates broke the silence, but no one was really hungry. I could barely hold the coffee cup between my hands. My fingers were trembling, not from nerves, but from the mix of everything I had held inside for so many years. Valeria was the first to speak, trying to regain control of the situation. She smiled, but her voice came out tense. Daniel, I had no idea about this. You never told me. He looked at her calmly. I didn't make the connection until tonight. I knew you had a cousin named Elena, but you never described her as the woman I met in the hospital. That phrase fell like a weight. Valeria looked away uncomfortably. For the first time she seemed to have no perfect response. My mother observed me as if she were seeing me for the first time. Elena, I didn't know your work was like that, she said in a low voice. There was no reproach, only bewilderment. You never asked, I replied softly, without resentment but without apologizing. And after a while, I stopped explaining. Daniel nodded. In the hospital, Elena is a reference. Other professionals trust her. Her way of caring goes far beyond the technical. My grandmother frowned thoughtfully. I always thought you just worked there, she murmured. That's what you always believed, I answered. Because it was never enough to erase the label they put on me. The atmosphere was strange, uncomfortable, but also honest, as if for the first time no one knew exactly what role to play. My uncle, who for years had been the hardest on me, shifted in his chair. I only think children need structure, he said without his previous firmness. They have it, I replied, looking at him directly. Ian has routines, love, boundaries, stability. What he didn't have for a long time was the respect of his own family. I didn't raise my voice. It wasn't necessary. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any shout. Daniel intervened again with the serenity of someone accustomed to speaking in difficult situations. In medicine we learn that not all paths to recovery are the same. The same happens with life. Elena didn't choose to do it alone. But she chose not to give up. That says more about her than any perfect plan. His words didn't sound grandiloquent, but sincere. And for the first time I felt that someone was telling my story without distorting it. At the end of the dinner, the goodbyes were awkward, different. My mother hugged me tightly, something she hadn't done like that in years. I'm sorry, she whispered. She didn't say more, but she didn't need to. My uncle murmured. You've done a good job before leaving, stiff, uncomfortable, but sincere. Valeria approached at the end. I've been unfair to you, she said without drama. I nodded. Yes. You have, I replied. It wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary. That night, as I left the restaurant, the cold air hit my face. I walked to my car with a strange feeling of lightness, not because everything was solved, but because for the first time in years I didn't feel invisible. Daniel approached before leaving. I said everything I felt, he assured me. I'll never forget what you did for me. I smiled. I only did my job. He shook his head. You did so much more. I drove home in silence, thinking about Ian sleeping at his friend's house, unaware that something important had changed. I didn't know if my family would be able to sustain that change over time. But that night had marked a before and after. I was no longer just the single mother who had made a mistake. I was finally Elena Vargas. And that was starting to be enough. 3 months after that dinner, I was in my kitchen cutting fruit while Ian carefully placed some cookies on a plate. The morning light came through the window of our small apartment, illuminating a simple but deeply meaningful scene. That morning we were going to receive visitors, family, something that for years had been unthinkable without tension, without awkward silences or judgmental glances. Do you think Grandma will like my solar system project? Ian asked with the nerves that only children have when they want to impress. I smiled. She's going to love it. Besides, Grandpa said he wants you to explain it to him yourself. Ian straightened up proudly, as if he had just received an important mission. In those 3 months, many things had changed, although not magically or immediately. My family began to appear first awkwardly, then more naturally. My mother called to ask about Ian, to know how he was doing at school. My grandparents insisted on seeing us more often. Even my uncle, the most critical, began to show interest in my son's life, in his hobbies, in his small daily victories. It wasn't all perfect, but it was real, and that for me was already enormous. The doorbell rang and Ian went to open it as always, looking at me first to make sure I was okay. My mother entered with a tray of homemade food and a sincere smile. There's my favorite little scientist, she said, hugging Ian. Seeing them together tightened my chest. For years she had kept her distance, as if fearing that loving her grandson meant accepting my decisions. Now she seemed determined to make up for lost time. Little by little the others arrived. My brother Alejandro, my grandparents, even my uncle, only somewhat uncomfortable but present. He observed the simple but cozy apartment and said, "You have a good home here, Elena." I thanked him for the comment, knowing the effort behind it. Ian approached him with his solar system model. "Do you want to see it?" he asked. My uncle nodded. And for the first time I saw them share something without prejudice in between. That gathering wasn't big or spectacular, but it was honest. The conversation flowed. Ian talked about his dinosaurs, his friends, school. My family really listened, not out of obligation, but out of interest. In a calm moment, my uncle pulled me aside. "Daniel called me," he said. "He told me about a community project at the hospital. He thinks I could collaborate. He said that learning from mistakes is also part of growing." Those words coming from him meant more than he would ever admit out loud. 2 weeks later, I received news that left me speechless. I was offered the position of supervisor in the pediatric recovery unit. More responsibility. More trust. A recognition I had been building for years without knowing if anyone saw it. I accepted with fear, yes, but also with a support network that hadn't existed before. My mother offered to help with Ian. My grandparents too. For the first time I didn't have to do everything alone. Daniel kept his promise. Always professional, always respectful. He recommended my work when necessary, without favoritism, only with truth. Valeria over time began to approach in a different way, no longer as someone who felt superior, but as a cousin who was learning to look beyond her own certainties. She even asked me for advice on some wedding details. Small gestures, but meaningful. The most unexpected thing of all was giving myself permission to think about myself. I accepted a coffee with a father from Ian's school, without expectations, just conversation. Nothing serious, but enough to remind me that my life hadn't stopped, that I wasn't defined only by surviving but also by living. One night, while tucking Ian in, he asked with innocence, "Mom, why didn't we see the family so much before?" I thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes adults take time to understand each other," I told him. He smiled half asleep. "I like having them now." I turned off the light with a full heart. Not all of the past could be erased, but the future was open. Today, when I think about that dinner, I no longer remember it only as a night of humiliation, but as the moment when the narrative changed. I learned that standing firm in your truth, even when no one validates it, ends up carrying immense weight. That being a single mother didn't make me weaker, it made me stronger. That my value never depended on meeting others' expectations, but on the life I built with love and perseverance. If you've made it this far, let me ask you something. Has anyone ever judged you without really knowing your story? How did you face it? I'd love to read you in the comments. If this story moved you or made you feel accompanied, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more real stories of resilience, dignity, and second chances. And always remember this. Your path, even if it's not traditional, also has value. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. See you in the next story.